for today's lesson, we're going to take a look at movement and part of the neural underpinnings of what helps us to move. And one set of structures we're going to look at is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is made up of several structures, including the caudate nucleus and the putamen. These two structures together are sometimes referred to as the striate or the striatum. A third structure in the basal ganglia is the globus pallidus. In this diagram, we can see where these structures are located in a cross-section of the human brain. All of these structures are going to be important in voluntary movement. And so while some of these voluntary movements may become more automatic as they become more learned, they're not going to be the reflexes that we see in the spinal cord or other parts of the brain. So when you think about having voluntary movement, about doing things, walking across a room or writing, that this is going to be one of the important set of structures that gets activated. The basal ganglia is connected to a number of other structures. The major inputs to the basal ganglia include the cerebral cortex, all lobes of the cerebral cortex, the frontal cortex, the temporal cortex, the parietal lobe, as well as the occipital lobe. Primary motor cortex, which hopefully makes sense since you're going to need to link up that motor area with this motor area. Also the primary somatosensory cortex, as well as the substantia nigra. Major outputs coming out of the basal ganglia include the primary motor cortex, so we're going to see a lot of communication from the motor cortex into the basal ganglia, and then the basal ganglia going back and talking to the motor cortex to help coordinate complex movement. We're also going to see output to the supplementary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, which is going to help us plan our movements. That'll occur via the thalamus, as well as the motor nuclei of the brainstem. Here we have a diagram that shows how all of these structures are interconnected. First, let's just take a quick look at the connections between the cortex and the basal ganglia. Again, the frontal, parietal, and temporal cortex are going to send axons to the caudate nucleus as well as the putamen, and then connect to the globus pallidus. The globus pallidus is going to send information back to the motor cortex via the thalamus. In addition, in this diagram, you can see that there are going to be connections that are excitatory as well as connections that are inhibitory. In this diagram, the excitatory connections are seen through the red arrows, and the inhibitory connections are seen through the blue arrows. You will see excitatory input coming from the cortex into the striatum, which, as you'll recall, is the caudate and the putamen. And then we're going to see some inhibitory connections from the striatum or the caudate and putamen to the globus pallidus, as well as to the substantia nigra. The subthalamic nuclei are going to receive inhibitory inputs from the globus pallidus, the exterior component, and send excitatory connections to the substantia nigra. So hopefully you can see that while this is a very complex interconnection of structures with both excitatory and inhibitory connections, that this is what we need for us to have this very fine control of our motor system, and that it needs to be maintained in this balance so that we can have very nice, smooth motor coordination. One disease that we associate with the basal ganglia is Huntington's disease. It used to be called Huntington's chorea. As your textbook notes, chorea is Greek for dance. And so when these folks suffered their disease, they looked like they were dancing because their limbs tended to flail around. And that's one of the hallmark symptoms of the disease, uncontrollable jerky movements. It's a genetic disease, and it's a dominant gene on chromosome 4. So if you have this gene, you will get the disease. It is a progressive degenerative disease, meaning that it gets worse over time. And what we see is degeneration of the caudate nucleus and the putamen, or the striate. And in particular, we see damage to the inhibitory neurons that connect to the globus pallidus. And loss of this inhibition leads to excessive, uncoordinated movement. So hopefully you can see through our lesson today that our movement is controlled by a number of different brain areas that have to work together. It involves excitatory or glutamatergic neurons as well as inhibitory or GABAergic neurons, and that when we suffer diseases that damage these areas of the brain, then our ability to move becomes severely limited. Lastly, I want you to take a look at these two brains. The bottom brain is a relatively normal brain. The top brain is a section from someone with Huntington's chorea or Huntington's disease. And you can see that there's a lot of tissue loss. The ventricles are much enlarged, and the caudate and putamen are essentially completely destroyed. And so this person would not be able to control their movements and ultimately would have died from their disease.